Hello and welcome to the first episode of High Standards, the show where we take a look at the weird era of gaming where video games released on two generations of consoles at the same time. There's a common misconception that these other versions are simply just ports to the less powerful hardware, when in fact they are completely different games developed by completely different companies that house their own surprises. If you'd like something to ease you into this topic, please consider watching the high definition versus standard definition video on the channel to get a better understanding of the show. Today we'll be kicking off things with a licensed game of all things, Spider-Man 3, the first Spider-Man game on the, at the time, next generation of hardware, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, with the last movie tie-in game being a completely unexpected success for both Activision and Sony. Stakes were pretty high for the next installment. The developers were even saying in interviews that this project was the biggest game they'd ever been a part of. And now this game was on a lot of consoles. The HD versions were on the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, while the SD versions were made for the Wii, then ported to the PS2 and the PSP later on. There are also the handheld versions, but those versions are obviously going to be different. Not much is interesting regarding those games, so we'll be skipping most of the handheld games for the show. The HD version of the game was developed by Treyarch, the same company that developed the later mentioned Spider-Man 2 game, whereas the SD versions were developed by an underdog studio at the time, Vicarious Visions. Now, this isn't Vicarious Visions' first time with the Spider-Man franchise. Along with a few Game Boy games, the studio developed the sequel to the critically acclaimed Spider-Man game for the PS1, Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. As Treyarch built upon the engine used for Spider-Man 2 to develop Spider-Man 3 for HD consoles, Vicarious Visions used their own in-house engine, Alchemy, for the SD consoles. That engine was used in more recent years to develop the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy. Yeah, the same engine that ran this also ran this. Now, for those of you that haven't played the game, let's start with the HD version. Spider-Man 3 is an open-world game that lets you freely swing around New York in classic Spider-Man fashion. There are gangs to stop, story missions to progress in, side challenges to try out, all kinds of things to keep you busy. The problem here is that it's not that great to control. As compared to Spider-Man 2, where the swinging felt momentum-based, Spider-Man 3 makes the webhead feel a little too light for my liking. Swinging is the equivalent to tying a feather to a string, but that feather likes to flail around somehow, not to mention the weird and janky combat. Fighting is the classic 1-2 punch system from the last game, just with some extra flair and whatever this is. You can mix and match light and strong attacks to create some bad combo chains. Enemies then drop like a bag of rocks when defeated, and stringing together combos feels like running through mud. Instead of skillfully timing your dodge like you did in Spider-Man 2, here you literally just hold a button and he auto-dodges for you, completely defeating the purpose of skill-based dodging. While the game's plot is loosely based on the movie, it does have, according to Treyarch, 10 different storylines that you can explore, which is fancy talk for side missions. None of the side missions ever tie back into the main plot. It just kind of feels like the movie's plot happens whenever you choose to progress it, which kind of interrupts whatever flow this game had going for it. One plot involves you stopping this group called the H-Bombers from blowing up a city, another has you stopping these girls from stealing jewelry or something, I don't know. Maybe one is just you sneaking some pictures for the cops. It's all completely different and self-contained. In terms of the movie's selling point, the black suit, you don't get that until later on in the game and you can't take it off. It's actually stuck on you until the game tells you to take it off near the end. All while this is happening, all the actors reprise their on-screen roles by voicing themselves, while someone else does bad motion capture. And this is what happens when you film motion capture and record voice lines in separate takes. You get this weird arm flailing and body motion that doesn't match at all. Now let's take a look at the SD version. While most of the core essentials are the same, a lot has changed in terms of gameplay and story. The game starts off in the same burning building that's in the HD version, then it cuts to a pre-rendered video taken from the HD version's real-time cutscenes, just stretched. So the differences between both versions become noticeable right away. The HD version combat is, like I said, the 1-2 punch system, whereas the SD version is a set string of attacks that can be upgraded. Dodging is also not tied to holding down a button. It's now a simple roll that can interrupt any of your combos so you can safely roll away at any time. Not only that, but you can also vault over enemies later in the game and perform attacks while dodging. The big difference is in the web swinging. So I mentioned that swinging in the HD version is like tying a feather to a string, while swinging in the SD version feels like attaching 4 jet boosters to a bag of rocks that's hanging by a string, but the string is attached to a ceiling fan. That's probably not the greatest way to describe it, but that's just how bad it is. The weird thing is that the SD version is the one that I grew up with, so I kinda got used to it, but even though I'm used to it, I still struggle to do basic things when swinging. Keeping the momentum is a bit easier here though, so getting from point A to point B isn't as much of a hassle as it is on the HD consoles. Now, most of the story segments are the same between both versions, but the SD game seems to go its own route for a couple of things. For one, it uses pre-rendered cutscenes from the HD version for major story sections, while using its own CG cutscenes for sections that they wrote themselves. You can easily tell which is which. I think what happened here is that Vicarious Visions received the outline for the game from Treyarch. Treyarch may have only finished the major cutscenes first for testing, so that's why those are the only ones in the SD version. For all the other cutscenes, VV had to animate them themselves in order to meet the deadline. But in terms of actual story, it's pretty different. A major thing is that the SD version has a campaign that's not in the HD version. Both games have you dealing with the lizard and his goons in similar but different fashions, but in the SD game, it eventually ties into you finding out that the vampire Morbius is in New York killing people. This vampire mission even ties back into the main story of the movie regarding the black suit. After this encounter, you can start finding these meteorites that relate to the black suit. Speaking of the black suit, that's probably one of the biggest things changed as well. Like I stated earlier, the black suit is given to you at some point in the story in the HD version, and it just stays on you. In the SD game, you're allowed to freely switch between black and red suits whenever you want. When you switch to the black suit, you deal more damage, have all the moves unlocked, and even perform different attacks, but this meter fills up. This meter is your sanity, more or less. The more you deal damage, the more it fills up. If it gets completely full, your attacks deal a lot of damage, but if you don't take it off soon, you'll black out. So when you take it off, there is a small QuickTime event, and afterwards there's this cooldown period before you can put it on again. I really like this system compared to the HD version. There, it just feels like another costume. Here, it actually feels like a gameplay mechanic. Now, when trying to choose which is the better version of the game, I think I have to give it to the SD version. While the HD game looks better, kind of, the SD game just feels more like a video game. HD is a bit too clunky for my liking, and SD has more of a charm to it, and that Morbius side mission is a big reason why too. So there you have it, the same game on different generations of hardware. Thank you very much for watching, it really means a lot to me. If you have a game you'd like for me to look at, please be sure to tell me in the comments or on Twitter. Be sure to check out the other videos if you like this one. With that said, I'll see you all in the next video.